Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Skills Share Session. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. We are just waiting for people, I think, to file in from the waiting room. Okay, so it looks like everybody's filtering in quite nicely. So thanks very much for giving up your time this afternoon to join us, everybody. Once again, we are joined by our host for the next hour, Brad Wattridge. Brad, how are you?
Yeah, good, and yourself, Gordon?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Thanks very much for joining us.
While we were sitting in the waiting room, you were telling us about your musical capabilities, bud.
Well, lack thereof, I think you mean.
Are you going to sing for us, bud?
Not today.
Not today, right? Not the right place.
Maybe towards the end of the year. And we're fortunate enough to be joined this afternoon by Offense Davey from the Center for Risk Analysis. Offense is a research associate at the CRA with a strength in analyzing geopolitical trends and risks. And so Offense is perfectly positioned, I think, to talk to us this afternoon about what is happening in Iran. It's a very difficult thing, obviously, with so much changing all the time. And in particular, the effects of what's going on in that particular space on South African businesses. So welcome to you, Offense, and thanks very much for giving up your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights.
Fantastic. Brad, can I hand over to you to take us away with the show?
Yeah, sure, Gordon. Thank you so much. So yeah, I think we can jump straight into it. Fence is going to share and take us through his presentation. And if we have any questions, please feel free to ask, even if you just do it secretly on the chat and you want to stay anonymous, an enemy, but it's okay, we don't mind. But I think the biggest thing for me is when I was going through this presentation and prepping and obviously keeping an eye on what's happening globally, is things do change so suddenly, but a lot of us businesses have long-term strategies that we're trying to put into place. And what I was really looking forward to today was chatting to Offense, who's really someone who is data-driven, to kind of hopefully clear out the weird tweets that we are seeing, or the conversations we're having around the braai, and actually just give us fact, and where we sit and where we can go. So, brother, if you don't mind, you can take over and get going. But we do encourage conversation. We don't want to make this just purely a presentation. So I will be just jumping in every now and again and just sharing a few insights and research points that I've picked up. But we really do encourage everyone in the room to, just post a comment. How are you feeling, about this topic? What impact is it having on your business? Is it a data-driven impact, or is it more of a heard it through the grapevine impact? So where are you sitting as a business owner or an industry player? So Fence, over to you, bud.
Great, thanks, Brad. And this is our latest briefing that we set up very quickly because, like you said, everything has been happening so quickly, and we made this slide deck just last month, and every single day we've been developing it, and even today I had to do some tweaks to it. So this is our briefing, the crude awakening, Iran oil and South Africa's fuel crunch, and I've tailored this specific briefing for the metal and engineering sector. As a disclaimer, or just for clarity's sake, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a legal advisor. I'm a political risk analyst. My job is to connect the politics and how the politics impacts your business directly. So I'll be helping with making that connection, and starting off, we can go through the latest updates in regards to the war. So at the moment, the US-Iran ceasefire was actually technically supposed to expire today, but Trump came out and said that it expires tomorrow, but Washington time, so that'll be Thursday for us. And this matters. This matters firstly because there are actually two ceasefires up. There's a ceasefire between the US and Iran that halted the attacks, but there's also a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and that one allegedly opened up the Strait of Hormuz, but that's also been a technicality in itself. Iran briefly declared the Hormuz opened, like I said, and oil prices fell drastically. This is oil prices on the market, though. The markets were very optimistic, and the day after it just closed again. We did see some ships make it through. About 15 made it through on the 18th, which was a big jump from the average of 4 and 6, but it's still, the strait is still effectively closed. Brent futures were trading very well and have risen back up to the 95 average. Oil spiked back by plus 6% on 20 April as tensions renewed and ceasefire extension prospects are being dimmed. We don't know how the negotiations are going forth, as we've been seeing conflicting news from both the US side and also the Iran side.
Yeah.
As I said, the Hormuz is effectively closed. This is day 53 of the war. Day 53 of the war, and this is the disruption that has been caused. About 13 million barrels per day disrupted, 230 plus loaded tankers remain stranded inside the Gulf, and an estimation of 600 million barrels lost of oil supply. This is 600 million barrels of oil that was not produced. So this is what's missing globally. Like I said, with the talks, there have been conflicting news and updates from both sides on the US and Iran side. And this is what we call the fog of war. The uncertainty has to be expressed. So be careful with the information you take in as well, especially from social media platforms and so on. Be careful of the information you take in and using that information to make operational decisions. It's important to be very clear in what you're communicating with your respective clients, but also with your employees as well. And finally, even if the Hormuz would reopen today, let's say, the supply normalization is going to take months. Like we said, about 600 million barrels of oil production has been lost. So it's going to take a very long time to get that back up. The risk premiums, it's going to take a long time to get that back down, and for ships to continue sailing forth smoothly, because now there's a huge congestion, there's a traffic jam. That's also going to take months, along with prices stabilizing again. And in terms of prices, it's important as well to differentiate the difference between dated Brent and futures. So Brent oil, the difference between Brent and WTI is that the Brent crude oil, that's what's particularly disrupted physically at the Persian Gulf. And the difference between the two is that what you see on your Bloomberg terminals and on your tickers and in the headlines, they show you the Brent futures. The Brent futures trading at around 95 and averaging around there. But that's not the price of oil today. The price of oil today, you have to look at the dated price. This is the physical or the spot price. That's trading at a $30 gap over the futures prices. So at around 126. This is the data from last week, from about 10 days ago. So at the moment, the gap has declined a bit, but it's very important to differentiate the two when actually gauging at the status of the current war at hand. There's a difference between physical prices and paper prices. And when looking at the share of global trade passing through the strait, this is what's being impacted. It's crude oil, it's LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, it's liquefied natural gas, refined oil products, chemicals, containers, and dry bulk. This was the based on average flows during the week before the escalation. So this is what's all being impacted currently. And when looking at the average amount of ships being crossed through the passage, we see that there was a huge decline. And the important one here is the tankers, because that's where the oil is being shipped across. But when you look at that line, the prior year's 7-day moving average, that's the average of what it was last year during that time. When looking at that, even if the Hormuz would open today, that loss won't be recovered in a day, in a week, not even in a month. This is long-term effects have already taken place from the damage that has that has been caused from this conflict. Looking at the US dollar exchange rate, so oil is traded in dollars, and we see that if oil is traded in dollars and we experience a weaker rand, then that hurts us being able to import oil. Although it's important to note that the rand was doing incredibly well at the beginning of the year and also throughout the second half of last year. We internally at the CRA, we made some predictions of where the rand would end up at the end of the year, and I'm lucky I'm not a betting man because I would have lost a lot of money. But at the same time, we can also see that the rand, we're used to the rand not performing awfully well. So at the moment, it's stabilized around 16 rand 40 cents, and that's good. That stability is good for us. We're able to work with that. It can be worse, but it also could have been worse. So the 1640 range is comfortable for us at the moment. But it's important to note that oil is more expensive now because of a contribution from the rand. When looking at our fuel prices, we see, of course, the latest hike has gotten 95 inland at 23 and diesel at 25. It's important to compare it to past escalations. So at the moment, although the spikes are high, this is not currently the worst case scenario. We have seen worse spikes before, some caused by the Ukraine war, the inception of the Ukraine war. So the prices as they are now, they have been worse. That's important to know because that's an indicator that they can get worse. It's important to draw out when scenario planning on how bad a worst case scenario can look like. So although these are the prices now, expect them to go higher. So by expecting them to go higher, we can look at the under recovery. Under recovery is the gap between what fuel costs to import and what it currently retails for. And this is the primary predictor of increases. So when going with the under recovery as of 17 April, we can make a prediction that petrol 95 and petrol 93 will go up respectively by 2 rand 50 cents and 2 rand 15 cents. And then with diesel, this is where the hard knock is hit. This is where we will see an increase of 7 rand 50 cents for each. This will have the prices at around for diesel specifically at 32, 33 rand. That's a huge jump. And that's not even the worst case scenario because it can get worse, as I mentioned, and we'll get to the scenarios a bit later. When looking at the import exposure for South Africa, this is what we import. We import from the Persian Gulf jet fuel, diesel, petrol, and crude oil. We import a lot of these refined energies, so diesel and petrol. It's good that our crude oil exposure is so little, and the reason why is because it's slightly diversified. We can see that our crude oil imports mostly come from Nigeria, which is good for us because we're not hit as hard as other countries that are mostly dependent on the Gulf. And then we see as well there's Angola, the United States, and Ghana, where we get some of this crude oil. The issue is when it comes to our refined imports of diesel and petrol. 34% from Oman and 34% from Oman in terms of diesel, 35% from the UAE in terms of petrol. So why is this the case? Why are we importing so much refined energy, so much diesel and petrol, and why aren't we importing more crude, especially from Africa? And the reason is because our existing refineries are on a decline. We've seen a shutdown of 3 refineries. All 3 happened in 2020, and if we tried hard enough, we could find a political reason as to why this has happened, some policy misdirections and so on, but also it's expensive to maintain refineries. And as much as it's expensive, some of these refineries have also been hit by natural disasters, especially the 2 in KZN. Explosions happening in refineries is quite normal. Explosions mixed with floodings as well, and other other kinds of natural disasters. It's just it doesn't financially make sense to maintain these refineries, and that's why those three have shut down, and we have only three others that are operational. Because of that, we have to import diesel, we have to import petrol, and now we are feeling the burden of that decision. So the impact of South Africa, that burden, this is where it's felt. In terms of South Africa's fuel reserves, our fuel reserves cover about 3 weeks, but then that is poor in comparison to the 90-day global average of what fuel reserves ought to prolong. The last statement that came from the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources regarding our fuel reserves and our fuel capacity came in 25 March. The government is not effectively communicating with us, and it can come over as a frustration. That communication is very important to help people to not panic. So what they told us is that supply until mid-April. Arrivals are sustained, are good enough, and overall we can last until the end of April. With more supply still coming in, there are also talks with Nigeria as well to get some more crude coming in. So that's the last update from the 25th of March from the government. Demand as well might soften because South Africans are going to try to spend less energy. So the demand for energy might soften, but the world, South Africa runs on energy. South Africa runs on trucks, and trucks run on diesel. So South Africa runs on trucks. Despite the demand having softened a bit, it's still needed. The macro shock, economies worldwide are entering the same shock, honestly, with the higher prices and crippled growth. This is going to happen widespread, not South Africa only. Weaker rand and higher oil mean elevated price and more expensive oil. The rate cuts that were planned by the South African Reserve Bank have now been paused. Disposable incomes are dampened. That's important because South Africa's GDP growth last year of 1.1 was mainly driven by household expenditure, by household spending more. We're not going to see that same trend this year because of this shock that's coming from this conflict. So that cyclical economic recovery, we may not see it. In terms of supply chain, of course, energy constraints, but also fertilizer. There's a lot of fertilizer that goes through the strait. And because of that disruption in fertilizer supply, we can see an escalation in food prices. And as well, on top of that, compounded, we are going to be hit by what analysts call a super El Nino. So next year, 2027, Southern Africa is expected to experience its hottest temperatures in recorded history. This is not good for farmers and compounded to the lack of fertilizer as well that's coming in. So that's a risk to look out for in the future. In terms of supply chain, of course, diesel-dependent trucks, freight rail, ports, agriculture machinery, high transport costs, everything that's put on a truck is going to become more expensive. And also the Asian petrochemical output that has been cut by 10 to 30%. Petrochemical output, these are the raw materials needed in producing plastics and resins and lubrication and industrial coatings. All these products needed in the engineering sector are now going to be at a physical scarcity if they are imported from Asia. Asia has been hit the hardest from this conflict, and thus that direct hit on Asia is an indirect hit on South Africans who are importing these raw materials, these petrochemicals from Asia. So when dialing specifically down to your business at hand, how does this impact your operations? Well, of course, as much as diesel impacts your trucks, they also impact your machinery, your forklifts, your compressors, and your generators where they are used. Your fixed overhead as well has shifted permanently upward. Any prices you set, any contracts where your prices are set on pre-March, on or before March, those prices are going to be irrelevant moving forward. You're going to be working at a loss. Things are going to be more expensive. So that's the hit that's going to be made on your operations, just things becoming far more expensive. In terms of your supply chain, so all the metals that are being used, metals are traded in dollars, and looking at the USD ZAR exchange rate, luckily it's stabilizing around 1640, but just beginning of the year, it was below 16. So that has also become more expensive, but it's not worst case scenario. We have traded at 17 Rand and it's not there. And again, I mentioned Asian petrochemical production cuts in these physical scarcity in plastics, resins, industrial polymers because of the cut from the Asian petrochemical production. In terms of our contracts and clients, I mentioned this again, your fixed price contract signed before March 2026 may be operating at a loss making without fuel and material escalation clauses. It's important to audit all these contracts that you have already signed before then and those that you're open. And if there is a window to renegotiate, do so now. And as well as any future contracts that you may be signing, take into consideration these changes in prices now. And in terms of your workforce and cash flow, for small businesses specifically, there's a thin cash reserve that are because of the thin cash reserves for small businesses. The small businesses are hit the hardest with the hardest squeeze. The input costs are up, and clients may be resistant to these price increases because they're also facing the same risk as you. Prices for them are also going up, and payment cycles are being unchanged, and thus a 60 or 30 or 90-day cash buffer would be the difference in absorbing a shock or making a distressed decision. So these are the costs your competitors are also facing. This risk is faced by everyone. The reason why I'm pointing this out is that the business that plans for this now and will price correctly will retain the client and survive the next shock. That's the difference between you and your competitors, is that you plan for these risks beforehand.
So Fense,
Yes.
I'm going to step in, brother, because
Sure.
you've been going at it for 20 minutes, and I'm sure you also want to just take a bit of a breather because it's a
Thank
lot
you.
of content to get through. I think a lot of what is being presented, I believe as business owners, we're aware of this in the back of our minds.
Got you.
And this really just helps us with clarity, and we really appreciate it. The big question is, a 60, 90-day cash buffer in most businesses is non-existent.
Mm.
It's either in a form of an overdraft, or there is credit or self-funding that goes, especially in the SMME space. And this is the concern. South Africa, we're so vulnerable because as business owners, we don't have the opportunity to have calm, stressless decision making because we're constantly under pressure. If it's not the war in Iran, it's going to be Ukraine. If it's not Ukraine, it's going to be something else that affects our rand, affects our supply. So we are just a country that's very exposed, I think, to international, situations and happenings. So I think we've become pretty resilient on it. But Donnie actually had a great question. He was asking, what do we do in a situation like this as business owners, or for those that are in management level? Do we start looking at, for example, moving away from the fossil fuel, introducing electric vehicles into our business? Is that also something that we can do in terms of long-term planning? And then I had a question around force majeure. Could you use that
Yeah,
to
definitely.
renegotiate?
Force majeure, that's already been used a lot by the larger corporations. So if there is space for small and medium enterprises to do the same, then very much highly recommended. The cash buffer, if there's an alternative to a cash buffer, then of course go for that. The idea is to have that mindset and being able to cushion yourself in case of a shock, in case of the next shock that's coming ahead. And later on, I'm going to present. Actually, I can just do that now. But in terms of the shift from fossil fuel to electric as well, that is recommended. The recommendation would be to diversify your energy inputs and energy outputs. Of course, the fossil fuels, oil won't be replaced anytime soon, but we know that oil is very much a high risk asset. It's difficult to work with oil, and if you can replace that in 5 years even, that would be very impressive. But the idea is to definitely diversify. So do that shift to electric is highly recommended.
if it's attainable, because
if
there's
it's
also a
attainable.
cost. And my other thinking is, maybe I'm a little bit off the mark here, but if you do have a cash buffer in your business, that can also be risky when it comes to your tax obligations.
Mm.
And I think I think it's very difficult to, like, we understand the theory of protecting ourselves. We understand the risk analysis and what we need to do as businesses. But practically speaking, if you go to any SMME, whether it's someone in Tonga or whether it's someone here in Boksburg, the average SMME just doesn't have the capacity to save. We just don't have that luxury, offense. So
Mm.
what else could we do other than is just being aware of the risk? Is that
Yeah,
good enough? And
that
just ebb and flow, be flexible?
sure. So just being aware of the risk is not good enough. There's a whole lot more that we can do. What I'll show you now.
Sorry, man, I hope I'm not jumping around,
Not at
Edward.
all, not at all, not at all. I'm enjoying this. So what I can show you now is the impact probability chart. This chart, we can look at scenarios. We look at scenarios by rating them on how impactful they would be to your businesses. There's low impact, and then there's high impact on the right side of the x-axis. And on the y-axis is the probability that this scenario will take place. There's high probability at the top and low probability at the bottom. So a scenario where there is a high probability that it may occur and will have a high impact on your business, how does that look like and what should you do in that case? So that's immediate management priority. This scenario looks like this, where the sustained fuel prices, oil at 130. It's not there at the moment, but it can get there. High probability of that happening. Import dependent material cost escalations. So your petrochemicals as well, the prices of that going up and the physical scarcity as well becoming more. Fixed price contract margin compression, freight and logistic cost surge, and also of course this ceasefire, that's where a deal is supposed to be made. There's a high probability that that won't be made. So have a look out for that scenario. A scenario where it's highly probable but low impact on the business is the rand dollar volatility. As I mentioned, 1640, that's a good place for us to be at. It can get worse, but it's not there. Client payment delays due to their own cost pressures. So your clients as well are facing the exact same risks and are going to have a hard time to also comply with their financial obligations, and also subcontractor pricing adjustments. Even if you may have a problem or at least have a restraint or a limitation in being able to adjust your prices in terms of the contracts you've already signed, some of your subcontractors may have the leeway to do that. So just also have a look out for that probability for that scenario. A scenario of high impact but low probability. The IEA protracted case, they've also have the International Energy Agency have also drawn out some scenarios that I do recommend looking at. And in the protracted case scenario, the global coal on stocks reaches an untenable 6 million barrels per day deficit. So this 6 million barrels not being produced. That's a high impact, low probability scenario. So contingency planning for your organization in this case. In this case as well, if South Africa's reserves are depleted, if the government fuel price intervention or rationing becomes a bit more radical and also takes more economic hurt on us, and also if there's a global recession. Low probability, but high impact. Contingency planning in this scenario. And then on the low impact and low probability scenario, just monitor, just keep it as it is. Don't make any hasty operational decisions. This is where the strait is reopened and this peace deal is signed by this current going negotiations, and oil trades below 90, not only futures, but also dated Brent. And in terms of that, this is what you should do with your assets. So with what you should do with your assets, there is a asset value vulnerability convergence chart, a mouthful. On the x-axis,
Do you want to take a breather? Because I have a question, but
sure,
do
yeah,
you
you
want to
can
hit
ask your
it?
question. You can ask your question.
You sure you don't want to finish off?
No, I'm sure you can ask a question. It'll probably help.
So yeah, I think the big thing for me is this for me is probably, when I was reading through this was probably for me the most important slide, because it really summarizes kind of the situation, and you guys have broken it down really, really nicely on where should I be stressing, where can I take a little bit of a breather. Is there an upside to what is going on right now? Is there any sort of positives that are coming out of this? Are we learning to be more adaptable? Is that making us better business owners? Are we not as spoiled as our first world brothers and sisters in the SMME space? Does that make us tougher? They say we're tougher. What are the gains here for us as business owners? Is there any, or is it just downhill in a basket?
Sure, that's a good question, and an anecdote I can give you is that some international business owners that we get to speak to, compliments that they raise to the South African business sector is that South African businesses are very resilient, because even before this war, the kinds of problems that South African businesses had to experience and learn from, it's the kinds of issues that other businesses in these developed countries have never experienced. Load shedding being the easiest example, but also the July riots and also the high unemployment rate, all the issues South Africa is going through. That has been a pro for South African businesses, and the international community does see that. They see that South African businesses are not operating the same as everywhere else in the world, far more resilient, and have better knowledge on how to navigate these disasters. This is just another one of those episodes for us. It's a learning experience for the whole world, but for South Africans specifically, we definitely have an edge on everyone else. Because of load shedding as well, we know how to deal with energy disruptions. So thus, a worst case scenario for South African business is not the same as a worst case scenario for a business that has no idea what a electricity blackout even looks like. And that's one pro that can come out of the situation. It's just what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, so it was quite interesting. I was chatting to I could say a friend of mine. He stays in London. He's got a business, and he was complaining about vandalism. He's got such bad vandalism, and where his property is, and he was explaining that, he just is constantly having to fix things and fix this and fix that, and and that is something where we are situated, we don't really have that, because we're behind all these barbed wires and electric fencing and everything. So I think problems are not just unique to South Africa. And from my perspective, when this is where I say in the beginning, you sit at a braai and you're having these conversations. Let's say, we're chatting to Dani, and Dani and I are having a chat. I think when you're not informed correctly, and you're not, for example, following the right, let's say, publications or the right news media outlets, I think it will, now more than ever, will cost your business.
Yeah.
Because you will make decisions with a very different visual than what you're putting on here. Because we get highly emotional. And that is something I have found, for being in business for close to 20 years. It's very emotional right now. When you started out in business, you buck up and you got it done. Now it's so many kind of gray areas that you've got to consider and navigate. So from your perspective, Afense, your opinion of keeping an eye on everything, knowing that it makes us more resilient in anything, do you think the days of traditional business ownership are gone, where you sit with 12 months strategic strategies, and are we now moving into a space of Mad Max like business strategy, on the fly, navigate whatever comes in your horizon, you deal with and you move on? And if you make it to your destination, kudos to you, you 1 of 8 or 1 out of 8. What is your opinion about business strategy? Is it Mad Max, or can we have a Downton Abbey business strategy that lasts for 200 years?
So it's neither one of the two. That's a very absolutist way to think about it, and there is a gray area in between that. So at the CRA, particularly me, I'm a political risk analyst, and political risk doesn't stop, it doesn't take vacation. There's always a political risk going on every single day of everyone's life, and from the day you're born to the day you die. What businesses should do is to take serious consideration of the value of political risk and political risk analysis. This shock now that's happening in Iran, at the CRA, specifically us, a week before we issued a risk alert saying that an attack is most probably going to happen the week after. And this was 7 days before an attack actually happened, and it did happen. And that's because this is our job, this is our bread and butter. We have to track these political risk analysis, these political risks that can impact South African businesses. So for businesses to for businesses, and a normal business practice to have is to continuously track any political developments that may arise, especially geopolitical ones that can hurt the entire world, because the world doesn't only run on the biggest economy or the biggest military. The world runs on who controls narrow choke points. The Strait
Yeah,
of Hormuz
very true.
is the easiest example of that, and it's not the only example of that. There are several other choke points and several other forms. They're not all straits. Some choke points are countries that hold monopolies in certain industries that are needed all over the world and so on. You can predict the next conflict. It's just you have to track it every day.
Is that why Spain is so cocky? Because they have control over certain strategic points. I mean, they're quite strategic in terms of location right now. What's
Yeah.
giving them the gravitas to be the way they are?
So mostly that's unfortunately just politics. I can't give a smart answer there. There's a political headbutt between the Prime Minister of Spain and President Trump, and that's why they're a bit cocky, because that's just the dirty game of politics. It's the kind of politics that is noise, that is distraction, that
Mm,
that that businesses should not be tracking, and should rather be tracking the actual impacts that can directly affect your
mm.
profits and losses.
Fantastic, brother. The next slide, again, with these two slides, really, I sat quite a long time with. Do you want to maybe just take us up on that? We've
Sure
kind
thing.
of hit the halfway mark. I think we've got about 20 minutes left.
All right.
So we can maybe, again, if I understand correctly, would this presentation be available?
Yes, definitely.
And you have a very close relationship with the association, so we always encourage everyone and anyone in these sessions to maybe reach out to Gordon to get your details. I
Sure.
see Nicole has popped your details on here. I know that we are connected on LinkedIn, and you do share quite interesting, can I say stuff without making you feel like it's not important, like interesting information. But see the next slide, what you're thinking.
Sure. So this is our asset value and vulnerability convergence chart. It's a matrix where you categorize where your assets ought to go, independent of the scenarios I showed in the previous slide. The importance of this is to not put all your eggs in one basket. Some of your assets are more valuable than others, and some of your assets are more vulnerable than others. So it's important to be able to group that. On the x-axis, on to the left of the x-axis is your low vulnerability, and then high vulnerability to the right. On top, high value and low value. So your assets that are of high value, but also the most exposed to this disruption, how do those look like? So these are your top priorities. These are your fixed price contracts with no escalation clauses. Of course, like you mentioned, it's a bit difficult for some businesses to have these mechanisms, but this is a general overview of what a
Yeah,
top priority asset would look like. These are your most valuable revenue by currently your most exposed assets, import dependent raw material supply. So your petrochemicals that come from Asia, those are at high risk at the moment because there's a 10 to 30% production cut. And also your diesel dependent operations, all your machinery that run on diesel, but your machinery that's of high value. You do get machinery that also run on diesel that aren't as important to your business. And of course, your long duration projects priced before March, any project priced before March and going on for the next 6 months, depending on how the conflict goes, that's a high vulnerability and high value because of the impact it can have on your business. Of high value and low vulnerability, medium priority, there's a discretionary import components of substitutes, any imports that you can get elsewhere, especially locally, your short-term subcontractor agreements on fuel and variable terms, and your older equipment with high fuel consumption relative to output. You get that medium priority, but you also get other medium priority that is of high vulnerability but low value that you can somewhat live without, but not to say they're not valuable, just of less valuable than those of when putting it in a hierarchy of valuability. This is your client relationships and pipeline work. It's valuable, but not directly price exposed yet. Your skilled labor and project capacity, high value, insulated from energy cost in the short term, and also your domestically sourced materials with local price and not impacted by the exchange rate, and also not impacted by physical scarcity because it would be produced here in South Africa. And then of low priority, this is your administrative and overhead cost lines, your locally sourced consumables, and your short cycle, low margin work with flexible pricing already built in. So the importance of this is that when you create your contingency planning, when you set up your tripwires, when you do scenario planning, it's important to acknowledge that to not put all your assets under one plan, all your assets under one scenario, all your assets under one tripwire, because they all have, you need to diversify your risk. You need to spread your risk and really put on paper which of your assets are the most valuable and vulnerable and which of your assets are the least vulnerable and least valuable. By doing that, that is effective political risk management is what we call it.
And I think we should all become a bit more prudent. It always boggles my mind. You drive around Joburg and you just all these amazing vehicles you see around you and these extravagant lifestyles. And I just feel like it makes you very vulnerable as a business owner. I think the more conservative you can be in terms of the way you approach your business as well as your personal exposure, the more calmer you can be in making decisions and the more flexibility you have. And I know this is touching on a little bit personal, but I know you've got a lot to get through, Botie, but we've actually got 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
And your rest of your slides are so useful and practical. I think I would believe the audience could go through that and really understand. And I'd like to thank you again for all the hard work you guys have done. It's really amazing presentation.
Thank you.
But I've actually put a little snippet on the chat section. And this is what kind of blows my mind is you have so much content coming out about the Middle East and Iran and US, and there's so much noise that you mentioned before earlier. I think it is important to sit with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a water and actually go through these slides slowly and on your own with a bit of music and just read through this, because this is a lot of fact driven. Remember, we spoke initially about Offense, being focused on data. So this is really important, guys, for anyone sitting in this session, is get hold of this presentation. If you find it's a bit high level and it's difficult to navigate, give Offense a call, speak to Gordon and see where they can sit with you and just take you through the presentation. But I sat through it and it really, really helped me navigate the noise. There's Reuters, Washington Post, Business Insider, all giving a different perspective on where we are. And it's just boils down to this whole point about you have to kind of sometimes be a little bit of an ostrich and stick your head in the sand and focus on your strategies. And I think this does it exactly like that. With 15 minutes left, Offense, what do you feel are the big takeaways that we can focus on for the guys sitting in the session before we go and drive 200 kilometers to Limpopo for our Easter break?
Oh, fun. Take me with. So a key takeaway I can give you is these, especially these last two slides, these are tools that you can use. So all those bullet points there, they can be tailored to your respective business. And I'm glad you're going to be sharing this. there's also a few more tools that are provided in the slide deck that
Yeah,
you can use,
yeah.
and I encourage you to use them. These tools are meant to be tailored to your business and to be able to give you a bit more clarity and ease and comfort in that should something happen, should a worst case scenario pop up, what do we do? Where are our assets? Where are our most vulnerable assets? What does a worst case scenario look like? Are we actually headed to a worst case scenario? It's a good way to, as mentioned, to cut the noise and to see exactly what plan you can set up and moving forward in your business operations and how to cushion the impact.
So do you want to just, there's the one slide that I thought was quite interesting was your tripwires,
But
know
yes,
when to act.
I
That for
wanted to
me
get to that one.
was huge because sometimes we do make decisions based on the conversations we had with our mates, over a game of golf or at a squash or at a tea somewhere in the morning. But I think it is important to constantly go back and just fact check the information before you react on it to make sure. It was quite interesting. I was actually telling my one brother, we were at a dinner and we sat down at dinner. It was 6 o'clock. It was a whole lot of us. We all business owners. We all sitting around having a great time. And the one business owner stood up, not stood up, said loudly, "Did you know the town that I'm from has run out of fuel? They don't have any fuel." By the end of the night, we all rattled each other so much that we were like, we had to go and put fuel in. We had to go and get
Yeah.
fuel in case, and that is what we do. It's kind of like the Lord of the Flies scenario.
Mm.
So it is important it's good to talk to other people about strategy, to analyze competitors, to be aware of what's going on in the world. But I think sometimes it's also important to just focus on your next couple of steps,
Yes.
just to make sure that you stay focused on your journey and on your path. And yeah, there's going to be hurdles here and there. But that's what I tend to do when I hit a huge challenge. I just take a breather, sit back, and focus on, okay, what is the next step that I can make that's going to give me a little bit more stability? Out of your tripwires, what other slides here? I know they're all important, but which one was your favorite?
Sure. So just before the tripwires, because the worst case scenario, your response protocol. So in effective political risk management, there are 4 steps to make it effective. It's to understand, analyze, mitigate, and respond. So we did the understanding. We understand what's going on. There's a conflict happening in the Middle East, so on and so forth. Then we analyze. How's that conflict impacting South Africa on a macro level? Then it's mitigate. You set up these scenarios and you allocate, you also set up which of your assets are the most important and the least important. That's mitigation. Finally is response. So should the worst case scenario happen, should an impact or shock hit you, what do you do? And these are the 5 steps that I won't go through now, but an important part of it
I've gone through
is
them.
that you set up a crisis team. If we are sitting here now for an hour long, and let's say something shocking happened that's directly impacting your business, without you being able to supervise, does your team know exactly what to do, or do they have to wait for you to come out of this call? You need to set up a crisis team and also allocate roles, predefined roles, whether you do this formally or informally. Allocate roles on what your crisis team ought to do should a worst case scenario that you set up takes place. And that'll be rooted in your tripwires. You set up indicators, you set up the trigger level that will trigger that indicator, and that's your tripwire for your actions. Of course, these are still general. They're meant to be tailored to your specific operations. These are tools that you can use.
I think it's fantastic. And I was just actually asking Benya, my AI guy, about the different ages, that economies operate. And it was actually quite interesting. I was reading something online about economies operating in the different ages, the agriculture age. We have defined it by time, but what this discussion was is that it's not time relevant. There are economies out there that are still in the agricultural age. There are some that are still in the technical age,
Yeah.
services-based age. And as South Africa, we actually operate across all of those different ages, which actually makes us incredibly vulnerable, but also incredibly diverse. And that takes me to a question of the power of our rural economies. it's something we've underestimated, I feel, hey, Ofense. I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at what's happening in our villages and you look what's happening in our rural spaces, there's a lot going on there.
Mm.
Do you feel that could also help support us as business owners with that kind of picking up the slack while we're navigating and finding our feet?
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion, and thank you for that. I should probably write an article on that. It's a good way to take a step back and see what we have before all these technological advances that are, whenever they are disrupted, now the whole business is going bust. But these kinds of businesses, these kinds of operations were able to operate before all these ages, all these industrial revolutions took place. And as you mentioned, in the rural areas here in South Africa, there's a lot going on. There's a whole economy that's running where oil plays a small role. It still does play a role, but does not play such a significant role. So taking a step back into some of those alternative methods that actually have been used for many years is a good way to look at an alternative.
Yeah, so I'm enjoying gaming and I'm playing the new Anon. And it's so cool because through the different ages, the different economies, and sometimes when cuck hits the fan, I tend to go back to the more primitive
Ah,
economies
nice.
because it kind of builds quicker and you can recover quicker and it takes less cost to run those economies. Is that just a gaming scenario, or do you think that is also something going back to basics and understanding where your big cost draws are and navigating that? I know that that's somewhere in the presentation, but I just wanted your opinion on it. There was something that
Yeah,
came to mind.
yeah, the issue with that would be with your competitors. So the reason why there was that technological advance is because it makes life easier. You're able to produce things quicker, get something from point A to point B in X amount of time rather than X plus one amount of times. So that's the only issue in dialing back to those old styles of operations, which is that if your competitor is able to ease the burden without having to do those kinds of alternatives, then you're actually hurting yourself. But at the same time, if your competitor is not able to ease the burden in an effective way, then that strategy of turning back to simpler operations can definitely give you the upper hand.
Yeah, we got 7 minutes left, Gordon, and we'll be closing soon. And I wanted to take the opportunity, Safenta, just to say thank you again for your time. We know you're giving up an hour and you are a very, very, very busy guy. But the one thing I wanted to, sorry, I had a few questions, and that's selfish, that I wanted to ask during these sessions that I felt they were pretty relevant. But one of the ones that it's not really relevant, but I felt it was important. A lot of great economies have gone through a period of isolation where their policies have been internalized. I know Trump initially tried that. I think he's moved away from that. But there has been times in the big economies and some of the fastest growing economies when they have had time of introspection and really cutting themselves off from the world to develop their own internal, I would say, different economies within their countries. Do you think it's our time? I know we were pretty isolated during apartheid, but do you think it's our time to do that now? The world is in chaos. We have big resources in South Africa. Should we not be doing what China did?
So we can do that, but in a more macro level. So rather than South Africa isolating from the world, it would be Africa intra-trade being more supported.
Okay.
So, as mentioned, we get a lot of crude oil from Nigeria. We also get some from Angola. If we just had this is gonna sound funny, but if we had a railway that connects Nigeria to South Africa, and if all our refineries were working, the situation we're in now in terms of energy would not be the case. So the not necessarily isolation, but some more heightened and strengthened Africa intra-trade would
Mhm.
definitely benefit the continent and each country in the continent. We can improve that, and rather than being overly dependent on these other areas in the world that are far more vulnerable to these
Mm.
to
That's a
these
good point.
shocks. So the oil in the Middle East, we know oil is extremely valuable, but it's also so vulnerable in especially the region it's in. Yet we have oil and yet we have oil in Africa. Why can't we fix that? And that should be the focus to not only South Africa in isolation, but Africa as a whole to work together and just to improve that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, the other day I found out, fun fact, that the Netherlands is the same, more or less the same size as Gauteng. So, and if you have a look at what their GDP is compared
Mm.
to us and how dynamic they use that space, I think it leaves a lot to be desired if we're looking at Southern Africa and then even further in terms of territory. We have an immense amount of resources at our fingertips as a continent. So I think that's actually such a great point. So, Fense, again, thank you very much. We are going to wrap it up. The time goes so incredibly quickly. I know there's always a lot to cover, but I think if you could just give us a 2 to 3 minute key takeaway that can leave us feeling a little positive, but also aware that we are in a bit of a tight situation, what would that be?
Sure. So key takeaway without even using my slides, I'll just go back to the 4 points that I made. I think I actually did add it in the slides later on, which is
Oh, there we
to
go. Oh, nice.
understand just
Yeah.
that last
See?
part, understand, analyze, mitigate, and respond. If you can apply those 4 steps in your risk management, then you'll be prepared. You'll be prepared for anything that comes for you, and you won't be so uncertain or uncomfortable with making some decisions, whether you feel like the decision isn't enough or whether you feel like the decision is too much. If you understand what's going on, if you analyze how it impacts you, if you can add mitigation mechanisms, and if you have a response team set in place, then you can be ready for any shock. And whatever shock that may come, it may hurt, but you know it won't hurt as much as it could have because you followed these 4 steps.
Yeah, and stop being so angry. I feel like we're
That
all
as
so
well.
angry with the world because things weren't what they were 20 years ago. It's not going to be the same. It is going to shift, and it could be worse, it could be better. But if you operate from a space of anger, I work with a lot of businesses, and the entry point when we first connect with them is usually like hyper aggressive, negative. And I think if you just can change that and understand that the world we knew 20 years, you're still very young, but the world we knew 20, 30 years ago, it doesn't exist. And the world we know now is not going to exist in the next 5 or 10 years. So the pace of change is going to happen incredibly quickly. So I think if you're constantly understanding, analyzing, mitigating, and responding, I think you could put yourself into a very strong position as a survivor.
Yeah, Francis Fukuyama was wrong when he said it was the end of history. It definitely is not the end of history, and more shocks are on the way in the future.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. Listen, again, thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you for your time. Gordon, I hope you found it interesting. I thought I was very captivated. And we're going to hand it back to you to just finish off. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Brad. Yeah, I was yeah, it's difficult after a presentation like this to kind of pinpoint how you're feeling. It's fantastic to get such
Sorry.
good practical advice. But I think those parting words are quite profound. I think there's a lot of I put a lot of stock in kind of trying actively to not panic too much about what you can't control, because that applies more and more every day, particularly in scenarios like this. So, Avensa, thanks very much. As usual, you guys are so on point. It's actually quite scary. But thanks very much for your time this afternoon. Just in the last sort of 30 seconds to a minute, if there are any questions from the floor, please, you're very, very welcome just to hop on and ask a question or quickly type it into the chat. As we've said, I think a few times during the course of the presentation, we are going to be circulating the presentation to everybody. So please work through it. And yeah, Fensa, thanks very much. Will you be open to members contacting you if they've got any
Yes.
questions and would like to drill down maybe specifically for their businesses?
Yes, please email me. Email address is there. You can also message me on LinkedIn. Please get in contact, and definitely available.
All right, 100%. In that case, thanks very much. Doesn't look like there's any questions. So I think everybody's got a great deal to think about. And thanks very much once again for your time, Offense. And I'm
Thank
sure
you.
that a lot of the members will be beating down your door and making your phone ring off the hook.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, hey guys. Chat soon.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.